Think of ancient Egypt, and you probably picture towering pyramids and golden burial masks. But the immense wealth required to build those structures was generated almost entirely by the physical exhaustion of 9-year-olds working the mud along the riverbanks. This generational poverty was exact and inescapable. You, your parents, your grandmother, and the family goat all slept in a single windowless mud brick room packed with straw. If you grew up in a farming settlement near Abydos, the geopolitical power of the New Kingdom Empire was invisible to you. Your entire existence was dictated by a single variable, the behavior of the Nile River. This confined cycle of labor produced the massive grain surplus required to support the priests, soldiers, and administrators who made the rest of Egyptian civilization possible. Look at the sharp line dividing the lush green vegetation from the barren desert in this image. The farming year began when the star Sopet rose just before dawn, signaling the annual flood that poured black, nutrient-rich silt over that exact strip of land. But before you could even press a seed into that fresh mud, the state bureaucracy arrived. Scribes from the local official's estate walked the freshly flooded fields with wooden measuring rods and papyrus rolls. The state calculated your tax debt based on the peak height of those floodwaters. As the water level locked in, it generated a firm quota. If the harvest failed, if insects swarmed or crops withered, that tax debt remained rigidly fixed while your food vanished. From the first day the waters receded, your survival was wagered against a government-mandated number that you had no power to refuse. Breaking the compacted earth meant swinging a heavy wooden hoe downward for hours without stopping, under a sun that baked the ground to clay. Once the seeds were in, you hauled heavy ceramic water jars by hand, walking back and forth from the irrigation canals to the individual crop rows all day long. Peasant farmers developed profound botanical knowledge. By age 9, you could diagnose a rust infection in a field simply by checking the color of a single barley stalk. Yet your family subsisted largely on coarse grain dust, carefully separating and surrendering the finest emmer wheat to fulfill your tax quota. This relief shows the posture of the harvest, men bent at the waist, pulling curved sickles through thick stalks of grain by hand, clearing vast fields acre by acre. The Egyptian agricultural system relied on this specialized, back-breaking expertise. Because the farmers could not read or write, they were permanently locked into this physical caste. Completing the harvest and surviving to the dry season offered no reprieve. The state required corvée labor, a compulsory physical draft owed by every farming household as the rent for living on land the pharaoh owned. When the mandate arrived, your family had to surrender its oldest able-bodied male to the state for 4 solid months of service. You were grouped into crews and forced to haul limestone blocks across dry desert sand to construct mortuary temples and royal tombs. Ironically, this brutal labor often provided a more reliable diet than you had at home. The overseers supplied clean, guaranteed rations of bread and beer that surpassed the meager supplies in your village. While specialized master masons carved the final details, it was this massive seasonal labor force that provided the raw muscle needed to move the stones. The slaves of popular myth were often just farmers paying their tax in the dry season. The finest wheat you harvested was shipped up the Nile and funneled into massive regional granaries controlled by the highest levels of government. This papyrus fragment is covered in dense hieratic script, used to cross-reference harvest tallies, calculate supply weights, and track shipments. These records allowed the state to manage rations for every non-farmer, from stonemasons to infantry. The ultimate stress test for this bureaucracy hit when the Nile failed to rise. A drought meant low water, withered crops, and an immediate threat of collapse for the population. When the Nile stayed low and the fields turned to dust, the records kept in these offices became the only thing standing between the population and starvation. When scribes reported failing harvests, regional governors and the vizier triggered emergency protocols to manage crises. They used the grain surpluses extracted during the good years to suspend current tax collections and redistribute that stored grain back out to the affected villages. This carved stele documents how a high-ranking official managed such a crisis. Successful famine relief and fair grain redistribution were documented as his primary legacy, carved into stone to stand as a permanent record of his service. This extraction of grain was a ruthless process, but it established a specific social contract. A peasant's labor fueled the empire's expansion during good years, and in return, the state's reserves provided the only hope of survival when the river failed.